Hello everybody, and welcome to the first webinar of the NBSAP Forum, Incorporating Targets and Indicators into NBSAPs. We're delighted that you can join us. We have participants from all around the world. This webinar will be up to an hour long. My name is Philip Bubb. I'm Senior Programme Officer with the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Centre here at our offices in Cambridge, UK. Today it's an untypically hot day here. It's 32 degrees, which we're kind of enjoying. And I'm sitting here with colleagues. They are Sarah Ivory and Sarah Walker, and we also have other colleagues from the NBSAP Forum team here in the office, John Taylor and Abisha Mapendembe. During this webinar, we'd invite you to submit questions on the subject of incorporating targets and indicators into NBSAPs, and to do that using the questions section on the GoToWebinar the webinar program. I'm going to give a presentation for 30 or more minutes on the subjects of targets indicators into NBSAPs, introducing key concepts, some examples, some experience from the work of UNEP-WCMC in supporting this work. And then we will do our best to answer any questions that you may have. And so if you could type the questions as we're going along, and then we'll do our best to respond to them. And as I was saying, the team here supporting the NBSAP Forum, which I'll say more about in a minute, are John Taylor, myself, Philip Bubb, Abisha Mapendembe, Sarah Walker, and Sarah Ivory. And we are part of the NBSAP Forum, which I expect many of you know about already, but just a couple of slides to introduce that. The forum is a community of practice offering coordinated information and resources, and target and demand-driven support for the people who are updating their NBSAPs at the moment. We like to think our door is always open. We welcome your requests and sharing of your experiences, either by email or through the NBSAP Forum website. This is what the website looks like, and we have sections on it of communities of interest, to connect with people, find NBSAP resources, and help with peer reviews and e-learning. And this is the address and our email, so please do use that. And much of the resources that I'm going to be introducing today have been developed as part of the work of the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership. And UNEP-WCMC is the secretariat of this partnership, which has been operating since 2007 to support both the development and use of biodiversity indicators at the global scale, and also national and regional scales. And we've developed a series of resources to help with that, run many capacity building workshops, and continue to do that. And much of that work now is integrated into our participation in the NBSAP Forum. And this is the slide from the homepage of the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership website, and highlighted at the bottom left is national indicator development, and if you click on there, there's a whole range of resources to help people develop indicators at the national level, including resources focusing on NBSAPs, and I'm going to be highlighting some of those during this webinar. So what we're about overall as a community is having effective national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And the context for this, of course, is the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020, including its IG biodiversity targets, which we're all very familiar with now, And target number 17 is about NBSAPs. By 2015, each party has developed, adopted as a policy instrument, and has commenced implementing an effective, participatory and updated National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So we want effective NBSAPs. And whilst many countries are on track for having reached this target by 2015, there are also many which are still in progress and some which are even just starting. And a key part of effective NBSAPs is that they have measurable targets and indicators. And before 2010, the previous generation of NBSAPs, one study found that only 3 of them had specific and measurable targets included in them. So now the new generation of NBSAPs are a whole step change forward in having targets that are measurable. And I think it's important to recognize that the process of setting targets at the national level in policy processes is relatively new. It could be seen even as a paradigm shift in policy definition, and the participation of many stakeholders and civil society in that process, and that having targets means that there is increased accountability for their achievement. So as in the past, there may have been a target in NBSAP which was, or a goal in NBSAP which would say something like increase the amount of our protected areas. Now the targets are increasingly specific and measurable about what amount of protected areas to be created. And as we'll be looking at in this webinar, that involves new levels of information analysis and participation and accountability. So the context, as we said, for effective NBSAPs is the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity with its shared vision and mission, and the 20 IG biodiversity targets organised under the 5 strategic goals. And so the aim of these goals and targets is to move from broad policy decisions to measurable real-world results. And so the IG biodiversity targets are aspirations for achievement at the global level, and also a flexible framework for the establishment of national or regional targets. So I'm going to be looking at that a little bit next. And so the process of setting NBSAP targets within this global framework doesn't automatically mean that each country is expected to produce 20 national versions of the IG Global Biodiversity Targets. Some countries have done that approach, and that's absolutely fine, and covers all of, obviously then, all of the areas of the strategic plan. But not all of the targets might be relevant to a national circumstance. One example would be if there's a IG biodiversity targets talk about marine environments, but a landlocked country wouldn't be relevant for. And so the most important thing recommended is that national targets contribute to the 5 strategic goals of the strategic plan, under which the IG targets are organised, and that countries adapt the global targets. But if a target isn't relevant, or if another subject is more relevant or important or urgent, then alternative targets should be established that work towards the goals of the strategic plan. So I'll give an example of that. So it's suggested in the process of target setting to start off with the context of the 5 strategic goals, and many countries have taken these strategic goals to inform their NBSAP or have modified them or detailed them as appropriate to their national situation, and then develop targets under them. So for an example, for an African country, their draft NBSAP has taken the strategic goal B, the same as the CBD, and in consideration of IG target 9 on invasive alien species, the national target they have developed for that is by 2020, the area invaded by invasive species is reduced by 75%, and measures are in place to monitor invasiveness of newly introduced species. So they've done some analysis consideration of their country, what's the extent of the problem, what might be achievable by 2020, and then set this target for their situation. So adapted it. And you can see that also that they have set a series of 4 milestones as to how they would achieve that target. That also is a recommended way of going then for the next step from your targets to developing the action plan and how you would be monitoring that. Another example from this country is under Strategic Goal D, enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. And in this country, they considered that they needed to have a target that said by 2020, women's access to and control over biodiversity resources and ecosystem services are improved. So that's kind of beyond the specific IG targets in addressing the need for women's access to and control over biodiversity resources. And they saw that as a particular issue and priority in their country, and they've set a national target for that. And then milestones, to establish baseline data on the subject and produce guidelines and to evaluate their progress in achieving that. Now, in the process of developing your NBSAP, the NBSAP forum and the partners UNDP have developed this guidance called the NBSAP journey, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now, and we recommend it as a very good resource to help have an overview and identify the steps involved in developing the NBSAP and where targets and indicators fit into that. And there are links here to the NBSAP forum webpage where there's an interactive version of that where you can click on each of the elements and it comes out with text boxes explaining them each part much more, and there's also a PDF of it. So just to quickly go through those main steps in the NBSAP journey, obviously there's getting organized, forming your team, taking stock of what's been done before, developing a work plan, and then engaging stakeholders, identifying them, communicating the process. So most countries are already well beyond that. And then there's the step, gather information, which has got many elements in here, which I'll look at more in a minute, to then take you to the step of develop the strategies using the information that's being gathered so that you can then set your national targets and establish your indicators. So as you can see from that, actually, there's ideally a lot of preparation behind setting national targets in terms of gathering information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those steps now. Just to conclude the NBSAP journey, then develop the plans for implementation, implement your NBSAP, and monitor and report on your progress. And so indicators will be a key part of monitoring and reporting. And also like to highlight for you that there's a whole package of resources on this subject of targets and indicators on the NBSAP forum website. This is the link to it, a picture of those guidance materials, e-learning and resources, and also where you can start discussion threads on this subject. So we really invite you to use those and to take advantage of that. And that includes e-learning, which UNEP-WCMC have developed on target setting and NBSAPs, and I'm going to be giving a few of the materials from that in this webinar. And that's on the conservation training website, but also you can link to it directly through the NBSAP forum website. And so now it's just some of the sort of the basics, the key concepts. So what is a target? It might be an obvious question, but there can be some confusion about it. Targets can be defined as goals and objectives towards which action is aimed. So they're about causing action. the word target is often used interchangeably with goals and objectives, and the distinction isn't always clear, particularly if you start translating to other languages. But the aim is that they are something that's specific and measurable, towards which action will produce a change. Targets can be confused with indicators. I'll give a definition of that now, and we'll come back to that later. But targets and indicators are different. It's important to distinguish them. So a target is a specified value or level of performance that is to be achieved or maintained. It may be for a predetermined point in time, such as achieve X by Y date. And an indicator is a measure or metric based on verifiable data that conveys information about more than the subject itself. So the indicator can be used to help measure progress towards the target, for example. And so why set a target? Well, it's to help move from words to action. So they help us doing this by inspiring change. Hopefully a target is phrased in a way that is inspiring, that's motivating. It describes a desirable future state that you want to create, brings people together by inspiring change. And it provides focus. A target is actually saying this, not that. Saying, like, for example, protected areas, we're saying we want to create 15% coverage of protected areas in our country, not 5% or 30%. So it gives you a focus as to what you want to achieve. And also targets help by establishing accountability. Someone is responsible for achieving this. And clear outcome-orientated targets help shape the expectations and create the conditions in which all the actors, governments, private sector or civil society have a focus to come together to develop solutions to common problems. And by establishing targets and indicators, progress can be assessed and appropriate actions taken. And what makes a good target? Well, people often consider that a good target should be a SMART target. There are different interpretations of this acronym. We could recommend these definitions of it's specific, it's measurable and attainable, and it's relevant to the subject, and it's time-bound. It's got a date on it. And a specific target will usually result from consideration of 5 W questions. What do I want to accomplish? Why? What's the particular reason that we want to do this? Who's involved? Where? Which? Identify the requirements and constraints. So that's good practice around targets. And I'd also like to suggest that there might be another element to this acronym about a good target. Is O, SMART O, that they're owned, that someone is accountable and committed to its achievement. That if it's not clear who is actually be accountable and responsible for this target happening, it's a bit of an orphan and it's unlikely to happen. So as part of setting targets for NBSAPs, it's very important to identify who will be the lead institution that is responsible for their achievement. That doesn't mean they will do all the actions for it, but they are the institution that's accountable for it being achieved. So it has ownership. And in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, a biodiversity target defines a desired state for biodiversity, ecosystem, species, or genetic diversity. That's fairly straightforward, but it could be any other desired outcome from the convention, such as sharing benefits, and it could be referring to concrete actions, such as establishment of protected areas, or the elimination of pathways for introduction of invasive alien species. And there's a very good resource created by the CBD Secretariat of national targets that have been produced to date in the NBSAPs that have been published so far since COP10. This is the link to it, and it's a searchable database. And so that's a very good resource to look at examples of what other countries have produced and how these have been related to the Aichi biodiversity targets. Now, a question that sometimes is asked is, how ambitious should NBSAP targets be? The global targets are ambitious but achievable, and there isn't a set rule as to how ambitious national targets should be. The most important aspect is that national targets are supportive of the strategic plan and move beyond business as usual, that they're taking you further than you would have gone just without any target. And the Aichi biodiversity targets are a flexible framework. So, for example, Aichi target 11 about protected areas includes, by 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water areas are conserved. Now, that 17% aim is at the global scale for all the planet of the terrestrial and inland water areas. But the appropriate target percentage area for a country may well be more or less than 17%. You may well, some countries have already achieved more than that, and they want to set a higher target. For other countries, it's appropriate to set a lower percentage of their national area. So national targets may be more specific and precise than the global target. Some countries may not set any national targets for certain Aichi targets, and they may choose to set more than one national target that contributes to a particular Aichi target. And it's suggested that whilst each party should have at least 5 to 10 targets, perhaps 1 or 2 for each of the strategic goals, 50 targets is too many to focus on and keep track of. It's a challenge to find this balance between a number of targets which gives you focus and is achievable, and actually covering all of the diversity of subjects which are in the strategic plan for biodiversity. But if you have just too many, your resources may be too dispersed, or it's too hard to keep focus on them. Now, moving to gathering and analysing information for target setting. So target setting should be based on an understanding of the current situation and trends of the subject to inform decisions on what the desired future outcome or target should be. And so that understanding requires a combination of information analysis. For some of the subjects in the Aichi biodiversity targets, you may not have information yet, perhaps new subjects relatively such as public awareness of biodiversity. And we recommend that don't be afraid to highlight what is not known at this stage. If data is lacking, we could make commitments to gather more information as part of the NBSAP implementation. And so, to look again at the NBSAP journey scheme, this here details some of the sort of key subject areas which you would want to have information on to help guide your target setting. Identify biodiversity status and trends on key species, ecosystems, biodiversity areas, assess the status and trends, and identify drivers of change. I know it's easy to say that, but there's a whole large amount of work involved in that, but that's a basic analysis which will give you the fundamentals for setting targets. And now the strategic plan for biodiversity is centered on the linkages between society and biodiversity, such as key ecosystem services and trends in their stocks and flows, who are the beneficiaries of those ecosystem services, what are the economic and social values of ecosystem services, and promoting sustainable resource use and consumption. So as much as possible, we want to gather information on those subjects. And then there's the wider legal institutional policy environment, biodiversity finance environment, public awareness, and then identify knowledge gaps to help you then set your national targets. One of the things to consider about in target setting is, are you trying to set a target for a desired outcome, or are you setting a target for factors that contribute to that outcome? For example, for the conservation of forest area, if you wanted that subject, is your target for the coverage of forests in the country, or is it about addressing stopping illegal logging as one of the factors that's affecting the conservation of forest area? And in all of this analysis of information, as well as tables of data and graphs, it's likely that you need to have some spatial data and maps, and often the use of GIS, and perhaps as far as developing models and scenarios of a situational topic to better understand what happened in the past, what's now happening now, what might happen in the future. And UNEP-WCMC, as part of the NBSAP forum, has produced some guidance documents on incorporating and utilising spatial data and mapping for NBSAPs. And these are the links to them on the NBSAP forum. And there's also an e-learning module which has just come out based on those materials to help you learn this subject, and it's available on the conservationtraining.org website as well. And on gathering and analysing information for target setting, we suggest that a good resource for this are the quick guides to the IT biodiversity targets produced by the CBD Secretariat, available on this web link here. This is a picture of example of one page, and these guides explain the target, and they have a section on guiding questions for setting national targets. And so those guiding questions will help focus what information is needed, what analysis is needed to support your target setting. And just to give a sort of little one example of what that might involve for IT Target 11 on protected areas, which is a very specific and measurable target, but it has many components. And so from this, you would want to ideally have information that would help you answer guiding questions such as what areas of importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services are not currently protected, how effective are existing protected areas, what are the opportunities and constraints to expanding protected areas generally and by ecoregion, and how these may justify higher or lower figures for the national target than for the global target. Remember the 17% global target. Who are the stakeholders, including indigenous and local communities that may be affected, and what additional resources will be required. So you could start to identify guiding questions for that. And now, once you've been setting your targets, making them specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, then once you're also developing indicators for them. Targets are more likely to be achieved if progress towards their achievement can be monitored. So target setting needs to be accompanied by definition of indicators, and then establishing monitoring systems for them. And so the monitoring process should be part of the NBSAP process, and allows for an assessment of the extent to which the objectives are being met and to make adjustments. And in the case of NBSAPs, most countries have some relevant monitoring programs, such as forest inventories and monitoring of rare and endangered species. So they're already producing indicators which can be used, hopefully. But it is definitely the case that the breadth of subjects in the new strategic plan for biodiversity means that investment in new monitoring systems and the adaptation and expansion of old systems may be necessary. And in NBSAPs, there are two broad types of indicators that are recommended to be produced. One are impact indicators for measuring progress towards a target and a desired state of biodiversity. and the others are implementation indicators, or also called performance indicators. I've also heard them called management indicators, and those are for monitoring the implementation of particular actions, for example, in an NBSAP. And you could use existing indicators where possible for those. So I'm going to explain those a little more now. Impact indicators are monitoring progress towards the target. So they're high level, at the level of a national target. You may have more than one such indicator for a target if it has different elements to it. So they're developed at this stage of strategies and actions. And you want to think ahead in setting them. How would you calculate and communicate and report these indicators? So an example for in Kenya, Kenya has a Vision 2030 development plan with a goal of achieving 10% forest cover by 2030. It was before their current NBSAP updating. So the impact indicator for that is straightforwardly the percentage of forest cover. Performance implementation indicators are tracking progress towards the completion of specific actions within the NBSAP. And so they are part of your implementation plan. So when you're detailing the actions and who's going to be responsible for them, then the implementation indicators should be relatively straightforward to say, did we achieve this action or not? And it might be in some cases a yes/no outcome, such as is the NBSAP adopted? So I'm going to give a couple of examples of things and ask you to sort of test yourself on this. So a performance implementation indicator, an example could be for the target of by 2020, pollution of lakes and rivers from water and land-based activities have been brought to levels that are non-detrimental to fisheries and wildlife. They've identified an action to carry out environmental impact assessment on all ongoing and planned projects affecting lakes and rivers. So the performance or implementation indicators for that are proportion of planned projects with approved environmental impact assessments, and proportion of ongoing projects with completed environmental impact assessments. So those indicators are about the actions. They're not measuring whether the lakes and rivers are polluted or not. However, it's not always a clear-cut difference between implementation and impact indicators. It'll always depend on your target. For example, percentage coverage of forest protected areas as a subject. If your target is to protect 50% of your current country's forest by 2020, then percentage coverage of forest protected areas would be an impact indicator for this target. But if your target was to ensure an improvement in conservation status of certain forest dependent species, then protecting forest areas might be an action to help achieve this target of improving the status of the forest dependent species. So creating protected areas would be an implementation indicator for this target. So just to sort of kind of test yourselves on this a little, for a target to reduce the country's surface area that's burned annually by 20% by 2020, if you have an indicator of extent of wildfires, is that impact or implementation indicator? Well, it's an impact indicator. It's at the level of actually what areas are burnt. And so it relates directly to the target in that way. Target of improve the conservation status for threatened forest dependent species by 2020. The indicator is number of monitoring programs in place. And so that's a performance or implementation indicator. It's measuring the action that's going to be taken place, but it's not measuring the forest dependent species, which would be this would be the impact indicator, proportion of threatened forest dependent species that have improved status since 2010. That would be an impact indicator for that. And one more on that could be by 2020, the value of ecosystem services is understood and used to inform decision making. So if you have an indicator of ecosystem assessment completed, that's an implementation indicator. And a target to protect 25% of the country's surface area by 2020, then if the indicator's percentage coverage of protected areas, that's an impact indicator. Just now, quickly, I'm going to go through actually just some of the basics. We've been talking about indicators, but what is an indicator? Just to be sure, the definition that we're promoting is a measure based on verifiable data that confirms information about more than its subject itself. So indicators are purpose dependent, and their interpretation or meaning given to the data depends on the purpose or issue of concern. So always determine your purpose. Now, turning that around, that means work out what you want the indicator, what is the question you have, what do you want the indicator for, and then choose the indicator. And the more specific and measurable the purpose is, the easier it is to determine the indicators. So the more specific and measurable your targets are, the easier it is to work out what the indicators are. And a top tip in developing your indicators is, if you're struggling to identify what is the indicator, it often means that your target or the purpose is not very well defined. And so we recommend working more to define more detail, more specifically your target, if that's the case. So indicators are purpose dependent. The same data could be used for different subjects, which is a good thing in some ways. You can use the same data for different purposes. And this biodiversity indicators can be used not only for tracking progress and achieving targets, more generally for guiding policy design and implementation, in the information gathering stage, and they're communication tools. They help build support, summarize complex subjects in a simple way. And the criteria for a successful indicator are that it's scientifically valid. There's a theory of relationship between the indicator and its purpose. What does change in the indicator mean? And it's scientifically valid that the data for it is reliable. A successful indicator is based on available data. So that's the reality, is that often we come up with a kind of wish list of indicators we'd like to have, but if there's no data, then it can't be produced. That they're responsive to change in issue of interest, and they're easily understandable, both the concept behind it, how it's presented, how it's interpreted, and that they're relevant to users' needs. It's no good if there's a very nice scientific complex indicator, but it's actually not relevant to what the policymaker or local government wants. And finally, a successful indicator is used. Now, sometimes there's a bit of confusion between targets and indicators. So this is just a little sort of exercise to help clarify that. So if you have a national target of increased terrestrial protected area coverage from 5% of the country to 15% by 2020, which are appropriate indicators? And I'm going to put some names of indicators up, and we can see which ones are the most appropriate. So one possible indicator name would be 15% terrestrial protected area coverage. But that's not a very good indicator, because it's confusing with the target. It's got a number and it's got a specific measure in the name of the indicator. So an indicator name shouldn't have a number or value in it. And similarly, if the indicator was called increase in protected area coverage, that also is not a very appropriate indicator, because it's still in the form of a target, saying, and so you don't want to have a verb in your indicator name, like increase or decrease, or improve or whatever. A more appropriate name for an indicator would be just protected area coverage, or better still would be percentage protected area coverage, which is then the measure that refers directly to the target. And I just want to introduce to you, if you don't already know, the resources that we developed as part of the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership supporting indicator development, this general framework, which is explained on the BIP website, where you can find these guidance materials in several languages, examples of its application in Africa. And this framework has got 3 broad sections of be clear about what the purpose is you want for your indicators, so in the case of NBSAPs, that's for your NBSAP targets. And then a phase of production to actually generate the indicators. So consider what data is, identify your possible indicators, gather and review the data that's available. And that's often a backwards and forwards process to work out what's feasible to then actually calculate and communicate your indicators. And then also indicators need to have a permanence, that they're produced consistently over time. So you need mechanisms for ensuring that continuity and sustainability. So you need your monitoring and reporting systems, and ideally test and refine your indicators with stakeholders. And there is an e-learning module which also explains those resources. And we've developed this guidance document, which is available on the NBSAP forum website, on incorporating indicators into NBSAPs along the stages of the NBSAP journey. And also a guidance document with 3 examples, fictitious examples, which illustrate how the Biodiversity Indicator Development Framework works in practice for NBSAP updating in terms of target setting and developing impact indicators for them. And to conclude, I would just like to introduce to you consideration of what capacity do you need in your country to be able to produce and use indicators for your NBSAP. So once you've identified them ideally, what's involved in being organized and successful for doing that. And this, I'm going to introduce to you a framework from the experience of ourselves in the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, of some of the elements that we found to help people be successful. So to have the capacity for producing indicators, obviously you need to have suitable data available. If there's no data, you can't have any indicators. So what do you need to have that data available? Well, you need a monitoring system to obtain that data. You need a system in place for people to be gathering the field data, the remote sensing data, to produce that. And also a key factor of success is collaboration on indicators and reporting between government agencies, NGOs and academia. We've seen that in the most successful countries, they have really strong collaborations between these 3 groups of government, NGOs and academia to provide the indicators, give them credibility, give them create a demand for them, and provide the data for them. So that's something that is definitely a factor for success. But also, you need to have a responsible agency for your biodiversity or NBSAP indicators. If there's at least an individual in the country whose job it is to be coordinating the development of indicators, then that's a very big step. But if it's nobody's job to produce the indicators, then they don't happen, basically. So identifying a clear responsible agency for the indicators is a key element. And with that, having national experts on your NBSAP topics that can provide advice and data that they may have and help promote them. So, for example, do you have experts on invasive alien species or on ecosystem accounting or public awareness or on snakes or whatever it is that your important subjects are? Do you ideally have at least a resource of experts in your country or region that you can call on to help you in developing the successful indicators? And so with that, to have people with the capacity to develop the indicators, whether they're in government or not, and the availability of technical support and capacity building, such as through the NBSAP forum and the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, but also, of course, experts in your country and region. And last but not least, obviously, funding for indicators. If there's no money, not much happens. And so obviously the amount of funding is a major determinant of your capacity. And the drivers for change for indicators are fundamental. So we've seen that in countries that have a high level government commitment to have biodiversity indicators, that gives the mandate, the credibility, the drive for developing the capacity, for having the funding, for having a responsible agency, for making it happen. And that government commitment, in part, comes from wanting to meet national and regional and global reporting requirements, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and other conventions. And if biodiversity ecosystem services are high policy priorities in a country, then that will strengthen the government commitment to have indicators. And a driver for that, having biodiversity ecosystem services as high policy priorities, is that their benefits are demonstrated. And so that's a role of indicators. So that closes the loop, as it were, if you can have successful indicators, then you can demonstrate the benefits of biodiversity and ecosystem services and get the commitment and support you need. So with that, I'd like to conclude the webinar presentation and to thank you very much for your participation and to invite your feedback on this webinar and suggestions for future webinars that we might do. We would really welcome that. Please email my colleague Sarah Walker at this address with your feedback and suggestions. And now I'm going to look at some of the questions that have come through and see if we can answer any of them. Yes, so one thing my colleagues have told me to say is that this presentation will be posted on the NBSAP forum website and sent to participants. Okay, one question is that we've received is, some targets require negotiation with stakeholders. So how do we go about and ensure this negotiation? Well, I think the first stage in that is to ensure that you have identified the key stakeholders in the subject concerned, whether they be government agencies, civil society, NGOs, academia, the business sector. Then a key part of negotiation is having people be informed. So ideally that there are information documents or analyses prepared which can form a objective basis for discussions about what the targets should be covering and what specifically the targets should be set for. In some cases it may be necessary to have a different negotiations with different stakeholders because of their different ways of working. Whether you're involving local communities, it may not be, that may be a different negotiation to involving the business sector, say. If you'd like more advice on that or have a specific question, then we'd be happy to try and answer that by email. We've had a question from that related to that of, are there examples of private sector taking up these targets or indicators into corporate strategies? I can't think of any examples right now. What I do know is that some countries have been very successful in involving the private sector in their NBSAP process. and have been. I know that the NBSAP coordinators have been generally surprised at the level of enthusiasm of sectors such as transport, education, mining, infrastructure, to fisheries, agriculture, to be included in their NBSAP processes. I don't know yet of any actual corporations that are taking up their targets, though, and yet in the NBSAP, but that may come about further along in the NBSAP implementation. Okay. Okay, this one. Okay, sorry. So here's a question that's come through. Percentage of coverage of protected areas as an indicator, but what about quality protected areas? How many of them are strictly protected? How many are national parks and wildlife sanctuaries? Does quality, or can quality be an indicator? Certainly, yes. That the IT biodiversity target talks about effective management of protected areas, and if one measure of effectiveness is how are they achieving their conservation objectives. So it certainly may be appropriate to have a high-level target about coverage of protected areas, and then other targets related to their effectiveness and the quality of protected areas. I think it comes down again to being very clear about the target, and then when you've got that clear, what indicators follow from that more easily. Okay. This one. Okay. All right, so we've had a question here. Are the indicators of a specific target the sum of the indicators for the actions set for that target, or is it a new and different indicator? Okay, so I would say no, they're not the sum of the actions for that target. So the indicator of a specific target is what we've been calling the impact indicator. So for example, a target about maintaining 10% of forest coverage in our country by to the year 2020. So the impact level indicator for that is the amount of forest coverage. But to achieve that, there could be a whole range of actions about establishing protected areas, controlling wildfires, reforestation, and there would be different actions for those. And so you would have indicators about the implementation of those activities, such as protected areas and controlling fires and reforestation. But they would not be in themselves adding up to the overall indicator of amount of forest covered. Okay, here's a question. Thank you for the presentation. Trends on biodiversity usually take more time to change at impact level, longer than 2020 or beyond. Have you identified indexes of certain groups, such as populations, ecosystems, or species level, used globally, such as the IUCN Red List or other ideas? Okay, yeah, so it's a very fair question generally. Yes, biodiversity change may take longer than the time period that we're setting our targets for, whether it's 2020 or even 2030 in some cases. I go back to the IUCN Red List as an index. It's a very good measure at the global scale and often at the national scale of the conservation status of species. However, one of its limitations is that it's not a very sensitive indicator to change in the short term, because it requires is based on periodic assessments of the conservation status of species. So until the experts have done a repeated assessment, say, of amphibians in 1 year and then again in 5 years as to what their conservation status is, you can't detect the change in their conservation status. So you may be looking then for indicator species or indicators or particular features of ecosystems which are sensitive to change. It's not you would need to discuss with the experts on each subject area what would be appropriate. Is it for threatened species? Amphibians are sensitive to many factors of environmental change. Would they be particularly into good group of indicator species? Are there particular bird species in your area which are sensitive to particular pressures such as hunting or habitat degradation? So you'd need to identify those on the basis with particular expert groups in those subjects. If you're looking at condition of ecosystems, are there particular features of the ecosystem, water quality in freshwater habitats, or presence of top carnivores in some habitats, which would be indicators of the condition of those areas. Okay, so we're just about to conclude the webinar now. Thank you very much again for all your questions and your participation. We can answer all the other questions by email. Please do email us. And we will get back to you. And please do give us your feedback on this webinar and suggestions for future topics, which the NBSAP forum, all the partners in the NBSAP forum might be able to do, not just UNEP-WCMC. Thank you very much, everybody.